Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. This is a very horizontal room, but hopefully you'll all be able to hear and see just fine, and luckily we have screens on either end as well. So welcome, my name is Abigail Favale. I'm a professor of literature and theology in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm very excited to be moderating this session on the lost women of the Catholic literary revival. So we will have 3 speakers this morning, and I'll introduce each of them before they speak. So first up, we will have Julia Meszaros from St. Patrick's Pontifical University. Julia's there in the middle. Julia is a lecturer in systematic theology at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland, and she has written and edited books in the field of theological anthropology. And she has a keen interest in theology and literature, which is the best combination, with articles in journals such as Literature and Theology and New Black Friars. Together with Bonnie Lander Johnson, who will also be speaking, she edits the Catholic Women Writers series, which puts back into print the forgotten novels and short stories of the Catholic literary revival. So today she will be speaking on Created Things in 3 of the volumes in this series: Josephine Ward's One Poor Scruple, The Fairy Stories of Enid Dinas, and Sheila K. Smith's The End of the House of Allard. All right, please welcome Julia.
Hi everyone, and thanks to Abigail and the entire organizing committee here for having us. It's really exciting to be at this massive event and quite humbling. Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. Augustine's exclamation, from which the theme of this conference is taken, contains some of the touchstones of the Catholic imagination. Today, however, I want to focus on what Augustine says next, because here Augustine puts his finger on a theme which has found important expressions in a body of literature that Bonnie and I are working to restore. You were within me, Augustine continues, but I was outside. And it was there that I searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you. Yet if they had not been in you, they would not have been at all. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you, now I hunger and thirst for more. Created things, we read, separated Augustine from God. Yet they are nonetheless in God, and what is more, God pursued him through those same created things. Augustine's observations reflect Christianity's incarnational logic, according to which God mysteriously uses precisely that which came between us and him, material realities and the physical touch they invite, to unite himself with us. Created things are a temptation, but also God's chosen means of self-revelation. So how then are we to approach them? How can they become not a barrier, but a medium between God and human beings? Augustine argued that we understand a thing if the mind takes interest into it and addresses the thing with love. But what addressing a thing with love looks like requires showing as well as telling, and this is where the theologian can draw great benefit and inspiration from literature. And to be sure, how God can be encountered in and through the created world was among the interests of the Catholic literary revival. In the English-speaking world, this is typically associated with authors like G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, and other famous names. Yet in fact, the revival's most numerous members were women. A few of these, Flannery O'Connor, Ruma Godden, Muriel Spark, for instance, remain well known, but most of them have been almost entirely lost. And this is why Bonnie and I edit a series for Catholic University of America Press, which brings back into print these forgotten women of the Catholic literary revival. These books all contain introductions, written in an accessible style but grounded in scholarship, that address the literary, historical, and theological aspects of each text. So we're kind of working to restore the fullness of the Catholic canon, or the canon of Catholic literature, I should say. Our first 3 volumes are in print, and they're available here through CUA Press. Carol Houselander's 1947 novel, The Drywood, which Bonnie will be speaking about later. Sheila K. Smith's 1922, The End of the House of Allard. And Josephine Ward's novel from 1899, One Poor Scruple. And our first collection of short stories by the writer Enid Dinnis is due later this year. And then next year we'll see our first Irish novel, a 1980s Belfast Troubles novel by Mary Beckett called Give Them Stones. And then there's many more in the pipeline, the short stories of the Scottish Catholic writer Anne Scott Moncrieff, another book by an Irish woman from the turn of the century called Rosa Mulholland, also our first non-English speaking novel, Carmen Laforette's novel, The New Woman, and the list goes on and on. There are actually just so many amazing Catholic novels out there that we just don't know of and that we need to find and restore. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the women writers of the revival were often especially attuned to the importance of material things for the operation of grace. Their life circumstances were often more embodied, more material than those of their male counterparts. Many of them juggled housework and child-rearing with their literary activity. Others engaged in arts and crafts alongside their writing or in social work. And this afforded these women with a keener sense, perhaps sometimes, of the sacramental quality of ordinary objects, activities, and indeed people, as well as with the temptations inherent in these created things. And so in what follows, I'll be drawing on 3 of their works in our series in order to explore our complicated relationship with material things, and in the process to maybe introduce you to these great books in a very short and basic way. Okay. Augustine's insight that created things kept him from God echoes, of course, St. Paul's admonishment to the Romans for having, quote, exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, unquote. It's from Romans 1. Both saints observe that human beings are tempted to seek life's meaning and end not in God, but in his creation. Quite how tempting this is to all of us, I think, becomes apparent in Josephine Ward's novel, One Poor Scruple. Ward was a friend of John Henry Newman's, and Elizabeth here will say a lot more about her in a minute, and her familiarity with Newman's thought shines through in the drama of conscience undergone by the novel's protagonist, Madge. Lovely name, it was popular then. Madge is a lapsed Catholic and a young widow. She had married into an old aristocratic Catholic family with whom she continues somewhat tense relations, but now a widow, has an offer of marriage from the sought-after and wealthy Lord Bellasis. Madge is strongly and relatably, I think, attracted to beautiful objects, and Bellasis offers many of them. Yet the drama unfolds when Madge learns that he is a divorcee, and her dormant conscience is awakened, because in the eyes of the church, he is still married. Ward's Catholic imagination prevents her from painting simplistic dichotomies. Madge's love of material things is not, it becomes quite clear, wrong in and of itself. In one sense, it is, for instance, shared by her very devout sister-in-law Mary, who lives in the kind of stately house Madge desires and who loves her dog and horses. Madge's temptation to choose beautiful things over other goods is, moreover, only one of many human temptations. The intellectual pride and ambition of another character in the book, Hilda, poses an equal danger to the soul, we see as the action unfolds. But nevertheless, it is Madge's immanentism which truly corrupts her relationship with material things. Madge views created things as mere objects to be acquired for this worldly comfort. She had, we read, quote, the faculty of impressing herself on the material things surrounding her, and as she demanded of them luxury, ease, and beauty, with a certain power of will, they yielded these habitually, unquote. Intent on subjecting things to her will, Madge has numbed herself to what Newman called the sacramental principle. This principle, which Newman considered the basis of the Christian imagination, and these are his words, states that heaven and earth, or what he calls the visible and invisible worlds, have been unified through the incarnation such that the visible world can mediate the invisible. And we've heard a lot about this at this conference, of course. The human being's twofold nature, its unity of body and spirit, has destined it for the priestly task of facilitating this mediation by orienting material realities towards spiritual ends. That is, by desiring and using them for the sake of higher goods, and thus by sanctifying them and returning them to their divine origin. As one theologian puts it, quote, "This world, the material world, is made for man, but to a religious man it is a temple where he serves. His work is something like a liturgy." But how is this task of receiving and mediating God through created realities carried out? The phenomenological philosopher Max Scheler argues that it requires self-transcendence, an opening towards another reality in such a way as to participate in its being. The stories of Enid Dinas, which unfortunately we don't have in print yet, but they will be out towards the end of the year in our series, they movingly illustrate what such openness actually looks like. Dinas, who lived from 1873 to 1942, belonged to the hidden congregation of the Daughters of the Heart of Mary. She was a prolific writer of fairy stories, but she offers us not a worldly, but a spiritual aristocracy, and not magic, but miracles. Like in Cinderella, her princes and princesses are hidden and unrecognized. They are children, pickpockets, mad monks, and what she calls silly-billies, simple folk who receive miracles through ordinary objects that turn out to be the very realities through which Christ saved us. The crib of a nativity scene, for instance, comes to save the life of a baby. Drinking from a wishing well redeems the village fool. An errant boy's heavy clothes bundle turns out to be his saving cross. And I would love to give you some actual impressions, but we just don't have the time of these stories. But as Dinas's stories stress God's presence in these things, they also insist, and this is what makes them so deeply touching and experientially moving, they insist on the importance of a person's inner disposition and really draw this out. In particular, on a person's desire or conviction that God will act through a thing. So in one story, for example, a religious procession conducted just by 2 children and a dog brings about a miraculous healing. In another, a toy cat that has been blessed by the priest on the insistence of a child has the power to actually change someone's fortune. And it might sound like these are stories written for children, but they're not. I would actually only give them to a teenager or an adult because they're actually that dense and complex theologically. And if you read them, though this sounds naive, you will actually believe this. She really manages to help you believe in the power of God and in miracles. So Dinas invites, in both cases of the toy cat and the religious procession, God works through material things because they have been treated as mediators of their creator. And I think Dinas is trying to help us relearn that. She invites us to expand the sacramental principle then with an emphasis on the call to sanctify the world through faith and love. As one of Dinas's characters, or narrators rather, puts it, no object has any intrinsic value with God. Its value is the thing that it represents in the wonderful heart of man. Now, it might sound a bit contentious. One could write a theological essay on this, but anyway. Regarding things as mediators of God or of life, truth, love, inspires sacrifices of time and love in Dinas's spiritual princes, even where these result in shame, sickness, or death. But being mostly young and simple folk, her characters often have retained a childlike resolve and purity of heart and can still view the created world as luminous. This raises the question of how the regular adult sinner, like myself, can relearn to approach the world as sacramental. And so this brings us to the last book I'll be discussing here. Sheila K. Smith's End of the House of Allard. This book explores this difficult challenge, and it does a lot of other things. It's quite a big book, as you see, and really rich meditation on love and vocation and so on. Kay Smith was a convert to Catholicism from the Oxford movement. She took that over from the Chestertons after they left, and then she eventually followed suit and joined the Catholic Church and wrote dozens of novels. Allard, this book, which was a bestseller in her day, charts the decline of an English estate and family and how its 6 sons and daughters respond to this. I'm sorry, the microphone keeps changing. It becomes evident that each of their responses is tied up with their view of things. Not unlike Madge in One Poor Scruple, Peter, one character, one of the sons, the eldest son of the family, sees the land and its houses as ends in themselves, as intrinsically valuable, just like in the quote we just saw, which they aren't, so this does not serve him well. His sister Jenny, on the other hand, intuits that if she has any right to the land, then only as its steward. But it is actually their youngest brother, Gervase, who is most attuned to how material realities can both hold us back from and yet also help us reach higher spiritual goods. Gervase detaches himself from the family's wealth and prestige by throwing himself into another kind of materiality. He, the son of landed gentry, becomes an apprentice at a garage. Jenny, his sister, comes to find him looking fagged and jaded and realizes that, quote, he must have a pretty hard life, up every morning at 6 or earlier, driving 15 miles to and fro in all weathers, working hard all day, and then coming home late, generally to finish the day with cleaning and repairs, unquote. Yet Gervase, we learn, and here I will quote one more time and at length, enjoyed the hardness of the way, the mortification of those early risings with the blue star-pricked sky and the deadly cold, the rattling drive in the Ford through all weathers, the arrival at the works, the dirt, the din, the grease, the breaking of his nails, his filthy overalls, his fellow workmen with their unfamiliar oaths and class grievances, the puttering of bolts and screws, the foreman's impatience with his natural carelessness, the exhausted drive home over the darkness of the Kent Road, the arrival at Conster, almost too tired to eat, the welcome haven of bed, and the all too short sweet sleep. For him, those January days in their zeal and discipline were like the first days of faith. Life ceased to be an objectless round, a slavery to circumstances. And though he still lived in the house, he did not belong to it. Gervase's experience reflects Newman's insight that the visible can fully mediate the invisible world only in the context of a practice of denying oneself inessential material goods and what Newman called excitements that stimulate us incongruously. That's his 19th century language. Newman here invokes Christ's coming down to earth and suffering on the cross, events which he reads as voluntary acts of self-denial on the part of God that suggest that self-denial is an, quote, incomprehensible attribute of divine providence. That's again Newman. Denying oneself the distracting comforts of created things, at least temporarily and intermittently, is key to it being Christ, not I, who lives in me, such that created things can be seen in Christ and Christ in them. For Newman, such self-denial consisted primarily in fasting. We see that when we see his slightly gaunt figure. He was quite intense about fasting. For Gervase Allard, on the other hand, it consists in hard menial work. In both cases, and this is what's important, the person's stripping of things is itself mediated in bodily ways. So Gervase's choice to engage in humble and strenuous work reveals an intuition that the freedom of his soul must pass through his body, that it requires him to physically relearn to relate to material realities as steward and servant, or indeed priest. Once he has regained his spiritual freedom, Gervase desires this to acquire bodily expression. He finds himself, quote, longing for the resurrection of the body, for his body to know what his soul knew, unquote. This, Gervais notes, and again highly Newmanian terms, Newman was all over the Catholic literary revival, the male writers as well as the female ones. And so it's really interesting as a theologian to read these texts with Newman in the back of one's mind. So Gervais notes that he longs for the resurrection of the body, for his body to know what his soul had already learned to know or gotten to know, because, quote, Catholic Christianity is the supernatural satisfaction of all our natural instincts. It doesn't deal with abstractions, but with everyday life. The sacraments are all common things: food, drink, marriage, birth, and death. Its highest act of worship is a meal. Its most sacred figures are a dying man and a mother nursing her child, unquote. And this is in a dialogue between Gervais and his sister, who doesn't really understand what he's on about. Whether and how Gervais's desire is satisfied, I leave to you to find out by reading these great books. But I suppose just to close, what I wanted to draw attention to here is how all of these stories reveal how divine grace operates in and through created things. And yet that this will only be recognized by those who understand that, as Psalm 24 reminds us, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. Thank you.
The tablecloth is trying to eat my legs. Okay, I made it. All right, next we'll be hearing from Bonnie Lander Johnson. She is a fellow and assistant professor at Downing College, Cambridge University. She has written and edited 4 academic books on Shakespeare and Renaissance culture. And with Julia, she edits the Catholic Women Writers series for CUA Press, and also writes journal articles on the forgotten women of the Catholic literary revival. Bonnie is also a fiction and nonfiction writer. Her short stories have won or been shortlisted for several prizes, and her first book of nature writing, Vanishing Landscapes, will be published by Hodder and Stoughton in April. She will be talking to us today about the first title in the Catholic Women Writers series, Carol Houselander's The Dry Wood. Please welcome Bonnie.
Thank you, Abigail. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? I'm going to check these slides are working for me. That's okay. Great. Okay. We live in a world of disenchantment, but there can be few who have not at some time or other experienced that sudden, poignant sharpening of awareness which reveals the sheer loveliness of our environment, a loveliness we had been blind to before. These are the words of Carol Houselander in the 1940s, when writers of the modernist literary movement were attempting to account for post-war disillusionment through experimental approaches to prose fiction. Houselander was absolutely of her time. She was at the forefront of modernist literary practice, but she always approached literary innovation with the eyes of faith. And in this way, Houselander, like all the women in our series, offer significant insight in both directions. On the one hand, their faithful interpretation of contemporary literature challenged and benefited the broader world of social and artistic practice. And on the other hand, for Catholic readers especially, their work drew attention to the ways in which doctrine and Catholic life can be experienced well through the contemporary. So modernism's experimental prose techniques are well documented by literary scholars, and although these techniques might appear at first to produce a kind of anti-realist depiction of life, they are instead seen as attempts to depict the very modern reality of being in the world. One of these techniques that I want to speak to you about today, I've spent the last few years kind of going through and accounting for all of the modernist techniques that Houselander uses and the way that she brings the faith to each of them. So today I want to explore her use of objects. Objects in the created world regularly feature in modernist prose as ways to depict the mind of a character in a specific moment of consciousness. These are moments that were thought by these writers to be much more realistic, but they were also moments that were created as a moment of an experience of difference from the 19th century novels that preceded them, and which did not feature moments like this, very concentrated moments of awareness by looking at or engaging with an object. So it's through things or everyday objects that modernist writers regularly depict a person's sudden, poignant sharpening of awareness, to use Houselander's words. So we only have to think of the really iconic modernist objects, Henry James's Golden Bowl, Virginia Woolf's Lighthouse. The writer who used this technique the most was Catherine Mansfield, and her characters find in everyday objects a potential source for transformation or a prompt to epiphany, but the epiphany never fully arrives. It never changes the character in the way they long to be changed, because the steady march of disillusionment pulls the character onward, away from the object, before they can be changed. A really good example of this is Mansfield's story, The Fly. It's about a businessman who is only called the boss. He's sitting at a desk and he's trying to ignore the grief that he feels for his dead son, who lies buried in a Belgian war cemetery, which the boss has been too busy to visit. And then the boss sees there's a fly in the inkwell on his desk, and without thinking, he picks up his pen and he stabs the fly down under the surface of the ink. And then he takes it out and watches as it struggles for life, pulling itself across the paper through this trail of ink. He feels this tremendous admiration for what he perceives as the fly's drive and ambition, his refusal to give up. And this is something that the boss feels himself as his most defining professional virtue. But how can he celebrate the fly's will to live when his own son is dead and when he himself has inflicted these injuries on the fly? Suddenly, he yearns for the fly to get up and walk away, but instead it dies. And this is the moment when he might have come to recognize his own nature as a bully, his grief for his son, his need for love and redemption, but instead his mind wanders. The boss lifted the fly's corpse on the end of the paper knife and flung it into the waste paper basket, but such a grinding feeling of wretchedness seized him that he felt positively frightened. He then fell to wondering what it was he'd been thinking about before. What was it? He took out his handkerchief and passed it inside his collar. For the life of him, he could not remember. So other modernist characters instead actually look with great passion at the things of this world, and they do indeed seek a kind of hidden life inside them. In The Waves, Virginia Woolf asks, what is the thing that lies beneath the semblance of the thing? For many of us, the answer to this is obvious. God is the thing that lies behind the semblance of the things that he has made. But that's not the answer that Woolf would accept. She's asking a semiotic question. She's asking, what is the substantial or perhaps abstract life of the thing that is obscured by the more limited sensory information that we receive from the surface of the object? So for many modernist writers, including Woolf, the things of the world do take on meaning, but that meaning is still circumscribed by the material world. If objects do point to the divine, they do so ironically, in the sense that a character with the potential to apprehend the divine behind the object never fully gets to this realization, but we as readers are invited to see it as a possibility that fails. So, Carol Houselander also used modernist objects, but she did so in a distinct way. Houselander did not repudiate her literary peers, as many Catholics of the 20th century did. She claimed that modernists were not the contemptible egoists they are so often assumed to be. Houselander saw that modernist literary objects articulated a natural and supernatural urge for communion with the created world and through it with the Creator. But she also saw in this kind of writing evidence of how our natural urges can fail or become misdirected or stand out as symptoms of modernity's descent into materialism. This is Houselander arguing that the materialist lives in the world of things, not those living substances capable of carrying supernatural and natural life, of being living symbols of love, capable even of transubstantiation. The materialist lives in the world of lifeless, soulless things, and yet he clings to them as fearfully and pitifully as if they were his only guarantee of life. Now, Houselander was able to diagnose materialism as a common psychological and spiritual illness in post-war Europe because she carried inside her the Augustinian perception of the natural world as the material world as created and still bearing the traces of its maker. So I want to quickly revisit this Augustine quote. "In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you, yet if they had not been in you, they would not have been at all." For Augustine, created objects have the potential to completely arrest the senses by pointing to the presence of the divine by which they were created. So you called, you shouted, you broke through my deafness, you flashed, you shone, you dispelled my blindness, you breathed your fragrance on me, I drew breath, and now I pant for you. I want to look at how Houselander uses this Augustinianism to correct the vision of her modernist peers. So first, I'm just going to give you a little background on the novel. The Drywood is set in a poor London Docklands parish. In each chapter, we meet a different character who are all drawn from very different social backgrounds. Many of these characters never actually meet each other directly, but they are all connected through the liturgy, which is the common thread weaving through their separate lives. But also they're connected through their shared, very tender devotion to a dying child called Willie Jewell, who they all go and visit in the afternoons. At the start of the novel, the much-loved and very self-denying parish priest, Father Malone, has died, and the new priest, Father O'Grady, arrives and finds immediately that the parish believe their dead priest to be saintly. So they all begin a novena to the dead priest for the preservation of the little boy's life. And this is the narrative drive of the book. We then move with all of these characters towards the two hoped-for events, the confirmation that Malone is a saint and the saving of Willie Jewell, and you'll have to read the book to find out what happens. So today, I actually want to have a look at has anyone read this book? Oh, fabulous. Okay, I want to look at the least likable of its characters, the one I think people will probably have forgotten the easiest. His name's Solly Lee. Solly is described as physically repulsive. He's needy and obsessive over food and beautiful objects like jewelry and clothes. He's lonely, and so he buys love by taking in impoverished women and dressing them and feeding them well. In this sense, he's almost a pimp, but we're given just enough information to know that his relations with women are not sexual. What is clear is that Solly Lee has keeps us, it's for our comfort. Solly Lee has definitely got a disordered relationship to creation. He's a materialist and a sensualist, but Houselander places him directly in the middle of the divine drama that is unfolding throughout the novel. Now, Solly was not raised to be a materialist, not at first. We're told that when Solly was a little boy, it was his grandmother who mixed a strange aromatic beauty into his daily life, she who imbued the house with a sense of mute mystery and made him aware, at least when he was a very small child, of some tremendous secret person to whom he must be beholden. His grandmother blessed this secret person when she ate the fruit that grows on trees, when she smelt fragrant wood or flowers, when she smelt fruit or spice or oil. She blessed him when the storm broke, when she heard the roar of thunder and saw the flash of lightning. But then Solly's parents move away, and they take him away from his family and his faith, and they isolate him. And his mother instead surrounds him with what Houselander calls a suffocating mother love. She overfeeds him, denies him nothing, encourages his materialism, and in this way destroys what Houselander calls the natural and good instincts in the child. We're told that long ago, Solly's awareness of the secret presence had grown dim and faded away. Now he wanted to possess beautiful things absolutely in his own right. So, to avoid loneliness, he takes these women in, he clothes and feeds them, and he seeks to possess them, but he's always haunted by the knowledge that however comfortable he makes them, as his own mother made him comfortable, he can never possess them fully. Their secret life will always be withheld from him. In Solly, there had been a flame, the real flame of life, but it had burnt out. There was still a boy who never knew hunger or thirst or any sharp desire, because hunger and thirst and desire were always sated, even before they were a pang in the flesh. It was this sated, flaccid boy who had grown into the grotesque man, who did indeed handle and fondle the material things about him, but who had lost that divine touch, which was the kind of communion through the senses, or at least through sensible things, with heaven. Now then, Solly sees that the people in his neighborhood have come together in spontaneous devotion to their much-loved priest who's died, and he decides he's going to cash in on the devotion by making the prayer cards. He takes the priest's image, as you can imagine. I mean, it's a standard prayer card. He takes the image and he soaks it with really rosy colors so that it's a kind of saccharine devotional image designed to appeal to the sensibilities of parishioners. So far, fine. But then he starts to add a halo to the image of the priest, and it's this action that brings the current priest, Father O'Grady, over to Solly's house. And there follows this hilarious, wonderful scene in which the priest tries to explain to Solly that he can't put a halo on the priest's face because he's not yet a saint. And Solly can't understand this very precise point of doctrine, and instead continues to think like a businessman, and he assumes that the priest is being obstructive simply because he wants to get a cut of the earnings from the cards. So through these prayer cards, Solly's disordered relationship with creation is forced to encounter a doctrinal understanding of how we as creatures are called to perceive the relationship between the earthly and the heavenly. Then Solly goes to the church to see the priest again about the cards, and there he sees a statue of Mary and the child Jesus. Now he stood looking at the little crowned boy and saw that he was turning, not shyly away to his mother, hiding his face in her breast, but outwards to Solly himself with an eager face of welcome and his arms held out. Solly had never thought of Christianity in terms of a little son given to man. Now he saw it was just that. Something in himself answered to the Holy Child, burnished and encrusted with glass jewels and emeralds and pearls, and the lily scepter in the hand and a halo of stars lit up by electric lights. So it's in keeping with Solly's materialism that he notices the jewels and the lights around the statue, but in fact, for the first time in his adult life, Solly sees past these things. He sees an object that possesses what Houselander calls a living substance capable of carrying supernatural life. And that object, the statue of mother and child, delivers precisely the moment of conversion that Solly needs. Thank you. Solly came out stealthily and stood in front of the sanctuary, because for the first time since he left his grandmother's house, he'd found somewhere that was familiar. He'd come back to something so like his first home that he could almost taste and touch and smell the forgotten beauty of it. If this place did not belong to him, in some strange way, he belonged to it. Now, this moment of realization is not fleeting for Solly. What follows is a spontaneous penitence. So, to other modernist writers, objects appear out of the material world to inspire moments of reverie in characters who ultimately remain unchanged. In literary studies, modernist objects have often been described phenomenologically as giving characters what Emmanuel Levinas calls an experience of everyday existence as haunted by matter. Literary studies has, in this way, failed to account for the Augustinian potential of modernist objects because few literary critics have read or understood Houselander's novel. Now, this is important. What needs to be recognized here is that modernist writers were consciously pushing back against narrative epiphany, because for them it epitomized the 19th century Protestant bourgeois novel with its providentialist plots that required of all characters a moral reckoning. So for modernists, the resistance of epiphany was a gesture towards realism. And Houselander was herself enough of a modernist that she too pushed back against the Protestant bourgeois novel, but her method for doing so demonstrates her resistance to both the 19th century use of epiphany and the modernist reaction against it. Only in this novel do we find a third way, between a Victorian moral unity on the one hand and a modernist moral uncertainty on the other. In Houselander's novel, there are, in fact, many missed opportunities. Lots of characters who fail to see the action of divine grace in their lives, and for these characters, the reader is instead shown divine grace coming to them through the liturgy, even if the characters themselves remain unaware of it. And in this sense, Houselander used modernist techniques to construct a realist depiction of Catholic life. We know that we often do not feel or comprehend God's presence or the loveliness of his world. We're tired and overburdened, but we also know that beyond the fringes of our awareness, God is always there making himself known to us. And it is this partially obscured reality that Houselander articulates so well in the novel, except with Solly Lee, where she really goes that little bit further. And I'm just going to close by noting that this curious role that Solly is asked to play, she uses him to offer a very direct Augustinian intervention in modernist literary practice. And we can speculate on why, but I'd say that one reason is because of his materialism. His psychological illness matches precisely the social conditions out of which post-war despair and modernist literary objects both emerged. Thank you very much.
All right, our final presenter is Elizabeth Huddleston, who's the head of research and publications at the National Institute for Newman Studies and associate director of the Newman Studies Journal, as well as a faculty member in the Department of Catholic Studies at Duquesne University. Her research interests include the reception of Newman's doctrine of revelation in 19th and 20th century theology, the retrieval of lost voices in the Catholic tradition, and the Catholic modernist controversy. Today, she will be speaking on Josephine Ward's novel, One Poor Scruple. Let's welcome Elizabeth.
Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so you'll have to bear with me. I kind of sound like Marge Simpson. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Nicola Center for inviting me to speak on this panel, as well as my colleagues, Dr. Bonnie Lander-Johnson and Dr. Julia Meszaros, for bringing these important voices back into print. I would also like to thank Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for graciously supporting my archival research in the Ward family papers last spring, and they're housed here at the library. Based on a passage in Augustine's Confessions, the theme for this conference encapsulates much of Josephine Ward's subtle theological vision. Why is this not moving? And as we have already seen a number of times, Augustine writes, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. You were within me, but I was outside, and it was there that I have searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you. Yet if they had not been in you, they would not have been at all. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in the breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more." We see similar themes of the beauty of Catholicism hidden amid the often mundane occurrences of our current creaturely existence in Ward's novel, One Poor Scruple. We also witness the enticement of worldly luxuries and the ultimate conversion of heart away from the allure of wealth and status, or away from wealth and status, to a life lived within the bosom of the Catholic Church. Before reflecting on the novel itself, though, we must first be introduced to the author, whose own lived experience of a unique time and place within Catholic society is reflected in both the setting and the characters in One Poor Scruple. Josephine Mary Hope Scott Ward lived and wrote during a time of great change. Within her lifetime, she witnessed, among other things, the electrification of both the public and private spheres, the rise of the automobile and factories, and a dramatic rise in the use of scientific and historical methods. These new methods brought about Darwin's evolutionary theory and the historical readings of Scripture. The use of Darwin to explain things in church teaching and the new historical methods, when applied to Scripture and church history, were often at odds with magisterial authorities. Ward also lived through societal changes, through society-changing events such as the Great War, which devastated much of Europe and England from 1914 until 1918, and the women's suffrage movement, though she fought against the cause. Josephine Ward's Catholic lineage was quite unique. She was brought up in Arundel Castle and raised by her maternal grandparents, the Duke and Duchess of Norfolk, after her parents died in 1873 when she was 9 years old. The Duke of Norfolk has been the seat of English recusant Catholicism since the 16th century English Reformation. She would have been living at Arundel Castle with the Duke of Norfolk when John Henry Newman published his famous letter, the Letter to the Duke of Norfolk, in 1875. Her father was James Robert Hope Scott, who was a Tractarian during the Oxford movement and a convert to Catholicism. From her mother's family, Josephine Ward experienced the peculiar life of recusant wealth, complete with an abiding faith that had conquered persecution throughout the centuries. From her father's side, Ward inherited the zeal of the newfound converts to the Catholic faith who converted during the Oxford movement of the 19th century. Themes of both the abiding recusant faith and the zeal of conversion are present throughout Ward's One Poor Scruple. In 1887, Josephine married Wilfrid Ward, who was also the son of the notable Oxford convert William George Ward. Formed by the English intelligentsia, both Josephine and Wilfrid would become two of the most influential Catholic voices in England at a time when the church was reckoning with the modern world. The ethos of the Catholic Church during Josephine Ward's day was reactionary at best and often hostile to certain aspects of the modern world. The Catholic modernist crisis, which is distinct from literary modernism, raged from 1893 until the death of Pius X in 1914. Despite the church at the time turning to an overly intellectual neo-scholasticism, Josephine Ward's writings subtly challenged the prevailing orthodoxy without putting her at any real risk for censorship, while at the same time challenging the more radical aspects of modern society, both Catholic and not. Josephine Ward's character as an author spanned from the late 1880s until the early 1930s. Her publications include 10 novels, a novella, and numerous works of nonfiction. As my colleagues Bonnie and Julia have pointed out in their introduction to One Poor Scruple, both Josephine and her husband were, quote, concerned with the question of how to realize the fullness of human character in prose, end quote, which was not simply a literary skill. It was also a form of theological inquiry. Bonnie and Julia also rightly note that Josephine, quote, held that fictional characters, if truly drawn, must live beyond the knowledge or skill of their author. If the author is not surprised by the actions of her own characters, then her control of them is too firm and too narrow, leaving no room for the divine to animate the fictional characters through the creative capacities of the author, just as the divine, through its own mysterious capacities, animates the human person. Okay. So now we'll move to the novel itself. Ward's careful attention to the detail of the characters in One Poor Scruple creates a realism that draws the readers into both the social and moral lives of the characters in a way that makes the reader question what their own motives and actions would be given the circumstances. So you end up placing yourself in the novel. Without giving away too much of the character-driven plot, We can now take a theologically led tour through Josephine Ward's best-selling but forgotten novel, One Poor Scruple. Ward likely derives her title from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, which reads, "Therefore prepare thee to cut off the flesh. Shed thou no blood, nor cut thou less nor more, but just a pound of flesh. If thou cutt'st more or less than just a pound, be it but so much as makes it light or heavy in the substance, or the division of the 20th part of one poor scruple, nay, if the scale do turn, but in the estimation of a hair, thou diest, and all thy goods are confiscate." One Poor Scruple is a coming-of-age story set in Edwardian London. It follows the Riversdale family, a group of young Catholics navigating their faith and societal expectations. The novel explores themes of love, friendship, and intellectual freedom as the characters grapple with the tension between tradition and modernity. The main character, named Madge, is the widow of the late George Riversdale. Madge has fallen deeply in love with the wealthy divorcee, Lord Bellasis, who proposes to Madge and promises her a life of luxury and wealth at Bellasis Castle. The scruple that Madge confronts is a timeless one. What will bring her true happiness? On the one hand, she could live a very privileged life, complete with diamond tiaras, a castle to call home, and a life lived in high society. On the other hand, she would be forfeiting her Catholic faith and her life in eternity for this extravagant earthly existence. Theologically, Ward is subtly exploring the theme of the visible versus invisible reality, as Julia has already mentioned. This was a popular theme in the writings of John Henry Newman and her husband, Wilfred Ward, who also used the theme as the basis of many of his theological writings. We see in Newman's sermon, aptly entitled The Invisible World, for example, that the invisible world is more real than the world of our senses. The riches of the invisible world are more fulfilling. It is the world of angels, saints, and spirits. Newman writes, quote, "In that other world are the souls also of the dead. They too, when they depart hence, do not cease to exist, but they retire from the visible scene of things. Or, in other words, they cease to act towards us and before us through our senses. They remain, but without the usual means of approach towards us and correspondence with us. And when a man loses his voice or hand, he still exists as before, but cannot any longer talk or write, or otherwise hold intercourse with us. So when he loses not his voice and hand only, but his whole frame, or is said to die, there is nothing to show that he is gone, but we have lost our means of apprehending him." End quote. The human conscience lies at the crossroads of these two worlds, the visible and in the invisible. Newman writes in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk that his view of conscience is, quote, "very different from that ordinarily taken of it, both by the science and literature and by the public opinion of this day." That would be 1875. "It was founded on the doctrine that conscience is the voice of God, whereas it is fashionable on all hands now to consider it, in one way or another, a creation of man." End quote. Newman sees a conflict between this quiet voice of God and the material world, which he also notes in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk in this way, quote, all through my day there has been a resolute warfare. I had almost said conspiracy against the rights of conscience, as I have described it. Literature and science have been embodied in the institutions in order to put it down. Noble buildings have been reared as fortresses against the spiritual, invisible influence, which is too subtle for science and too profound for literature." End quote. Ward's exploration of this interplay between the visible and invisible, or more precisely put, the eternal and the ephemeral, is most profound in Madge's desire to maintain her Catholic identity, but more importantly for her, to commune with her daughter again, who died in infancy. Madge knows that if she marries the divorcee, though she will gain all the worldly riches that she can fathom, she will forfeit life and eternity and all the riches that come with it, such as seeing her daughter again. Ward makes this clear in the last chapter of the book when she incorporates a quotes from Montalembert, who was a real person. Quoted in French, the translation reading, quote, "Who is this invisible lover who died on a gallows 18 centuries ago and who thus attracts youth, beauty, and love to himself? Is it a man? No, he's a god." Continuing, Ward writes, quote, "That is," and this is a translation, "that is the only explanation of the mystery," Father Gabriel muttered. "The answer to this riddle of life offered by crowds of such young girls, the Creator has undertaken to fill the hearts of his creatures if they give up all to him. No wonder they are happy," end quote. Well, this was uttered in response to Mary, who was the one who ultimately became a nun, whom I would argue is a second protagonist and has her own scruple as to whether to join the convent or not. The message applies directly to Madge as well. And most importantly, this theme also applies to the reader. The beauty of Ward's realism is that it causes the reader to question what he or she would do if put in a similar situation. The theological idea is also transferable to even those of us who are not confronted with such worldly extravagances as Madge. I personally have never been invited to live in a castle. But who nonetheless must often choose between worldly pleasure and that of the eternal. This theological message is what makes this book so prevalent for our own day. It is both entertaining and theologically provocative. The influence, and so this is in conclusion, the influence of Josephine Ward's One Per Scruple was far-reaching in English-speaking locales, as well as in France. As one reviewer of Ward's later book, Out of Due Time, notes, quote, "By her former work, One Poor Scruple, Miss Wilfred Ward secures for herself a high place among living novelists. The wide success and high appreciation that it won proved that a religious novel extolling Catholic ideals, when written with ability, truthfulness, and a knowledge of life, could command the favorable attention of non-Catholics and might be a very efficient exposition and winning defense of Catholic truth, securing attention in quarters closed and guarded by the twin sentinels of prejudice and contemptuous indifference against any literature making a formal plea for Catholicism," end quote. The famous French theologian Henri Bremond describes One Poor Scruple as having both literary and apologetic value in his nearly 40-page review essay and theological exposition of the novel. He was quite verbose. While Bremond is squarely situated in his own time and place, the turn of the 20th century France, his challenge of the bourgeois view of Catholic life and doctrine can also be seen as a direct challenge for Catholics in our own day, even the most observant and scrupulous of us. Bremond writes that One Poor Scruples challenges Catholics in this way, and this is my attempt at a translation. Quote, "There are, in fact, even among the most convinced, restless, and demanding minds who wonder why the church in its daily life does not achieve more of the ideal. Their scandal does not come from the multitude of sinners, but from the bourgeois security of the righteous, the banal mass of good people, from whom they do not pride themselves on being separated, causes them a sort of discomfort. These good people are determined to reap the joys of this world and confess on their deathbed. What then? Is all this Catholic? And is this all that the ancient ferment which turned the world upside down can do today?" End quote. With this, I will leave you with Bremond's challenge. So thank you for your time and your attention.
Well, our speakers have been scrupulous with keeping in time, so we have 15 minutes for questions. And I'd like to kick it off with a question. And I noticed a pattern in several of the talks that in their time, many of these works were best-selling and were popular, maybe even outselling some of the counterparts that are more read today. So I wonder, can you speculate about why these books have been forgotten if they were so kind of popular in their time?
Is this one working? Can you hear me? We probably don't need them anyway. Do we need them? I'm used to
it's kind of a weird
projecting
room.
it. I don't. Is it okay? Cool. Yeah, that's well. How many reasons might there be? We had a go, didn't we, at listing them in the series introduction. I think there's changing tastes in post-war literature. So these three, well, the Ward and the Allard are pre-war or interwar, which actually, it's surprising when you read them how accessible they are. They don't read like a 19th century novel, for instance, especially the Allard. It's just so easy to read. It could have been written a decade ago. There's no tricks or flourish. I won't go as far as saying it's populist necessarily because she's so theologically thoughtful, but there's absolutely no challenge or difficulty in the language. So they've all got particular reasons why they fell out of favor. I think with the Sheila K. Smith, she was writing about Sussex in particular, and maybe the easiness of the prose itself is one of the reasons that it wasn't considered literary enough to be held on the university curriculum after the wars. Ward, Houselander, I don't know. I think the Catholicism for that one would have been difficult for university curriculums. And then there's always the question of feminism. We have a line, don't we? I can't remember what it is, but these novels fall through the gaps somehow. They're not feminist enough because of the Catholicism to be picked up by the post-1960s presses like Virago. But for whatever reasons we might collectively speculate on, Catholic readers also let them go. And I think we all have to answer for why that may have happened. But I also think I'd like us all to feel beholden, those of us in universities, especially I'm in a literature department, we actually do have a responsibility to hold on to books. Especially novels by women disappear every year. It's amazing. The archive is stuffed with fabulous books by men and women, but especially by women. And if we don't make the effort to read them critically and share them with our students and think about them and their historical value, they will simply vanish. So it's, I think, part of our professional calling to keep reading. Yeah, I'll stop.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add too is just the trends within the church, because Bonnie, is this working? Yeah. Bonnie mentioned the more sort of feminist inclinations among the commercial presses after the war, but the church too, I suppose, after the council, and there's nothing wrong with this, but had taken quite a political turn or an interest in socio-political issues. Whereas, like I was saying, a lot of these women actually were mothers and housewives, and so their angle often is more from within a more domestic setting, or that of a school or a convent, or community-oriented settings, and then looking at the interpersonal relationships within those, the role of a mother, etc. And so I just think that didn't even suit the trends within the church either in the second half of the 20th century. But it actually very much suits our needs today, where a lot of us are homeschooling. I personally am not, but I know many people here are, so, and yet also writing and trying to juggle exactly the same interest that these women were juggling. So, and not just that, but obviously just facing an increasingly secular world. That was very much the experience of Catholics in England at the turn of the century as well. How do we enter into this world? Catholics suddenly were allowed to join public life after Catholic emancipation in the 19th century, but they needed to figure out how to do it without losing their faith, and this is very much a challenge we're facing today. So we've found that whatever exactly the reasons, we can't fully know. I mean, it's also to do with how a canon is written in the first place. Oftentimes the academics writing these canons in literary departments are perhaps more male or interested in particular types of political, anyway. But either way, the point is that they are very timeless novels that are of great interest, I think, and not just timeless, but actually especially relevant today.
Hi, Carla Galdo. Thank you so much for this project. I'm so grateful for it. So 2 questions. I'm very curious, what have been maybe your most practical challenges in this project, and kind of theoretical challenges, maybe in terms of selection? And then also, how can we in this room support your mission to get these books into the hands of others?
What a fabulous
As writers
question.
or just
Thank you.
teachers?
Thank you so much. Do you want to?
Well, I'll start on the latter point, and then because Bonnie can
Yeah.
speak best to the challenges. I suppose, tell us about other books you find, and when you read stuff, be alert in terms of references to fellow writers. So, someone like Muriel Spark might actually have been in correspondence with some, or Ruma Godden, for instance, bought the house that Sheila K. Smith ran her farm from, and so they clearly knew each other. There are links between some of the known figures and the lesser known ones. So anyway, the point is, when you come across new names, track them down, see what did they write, and look at it. There's so much to be discovered, and it would be great for you to be part of this project. We've now got our first, we wrote the introductions, co-wrote them to the first few volumes, but now we're starting to bring other people who know an author better than we do into. So Elizabeth will probably write one on another ward title sometime soon, and so on. So yeah, get in touch with us, email us, and that's one thing anyway. But
I'd also say reading groups. There's quite a few parish groups
Yes.
that have begun in England, and not just women. I mean, these books, the characters are in no way solely female. As Julia mentioned, they're often set in schools and convents. There's a whole list of amazing convent novels, some of which are in print, but quite a few that we've lost, so we're attempting to bring them back as well. So these are sort of familiar places to us, but they're not the places we usually read about. So I would, please think about a parish group or a mum's group or whatever it suits your lifestyle, and let us know what you think of the books. We'd love to receive emails. But to your question about... Go, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was just going to say the National Institute for Newman Studies is reading. We're currently reading through Josephine Ward's One Per Scruple, and then right after in January and February we'll be reading through the Drywood and online, and we have people from nearly every continent participating. So if you're interested, let me know, and I can get you information. We meet once a month and go through parts of it.
Just quickly on the practicalities, it's a lot of work. A lot of these are still in copyright, actually, so we do a lot of hunting for rights, and we just went through the experience of translating the Leifret novel, which was, commissioning a translator, getting the Spanish government to pay for it. It is a lot of work, so it's a passion project, and we really appreciate your support.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. So I'm working on a project right now about women converts. So I was struck by the prominence of either converts or daughters of converts. Mm-hmm. Would you guys speculate on why you think the converts are so prominent in this movement?
yeah, sure. You can add. Oh, Elizabeth, yeah? You wanted something to say?
Sure. Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to those who were either from the Oxford movement, converts during the Oxford movement, or a little bit later. Movement, there was a huge liturgical movement around that time, and you saw just a swath of conversions. Why, I'm still kind of trying to figure out. There are lots of minute reasons, but I haven't been able to put my thumb on exactly why. But I'm sure, changing laws and a growing less ambivalent society towards Catholicism probably helped.
A lot of artists became converts in those decades immediately after the re-establishment, and I think the pre-Vatican II liturgy was attractive to them. Some of them, were really flamboyant and lived. We've just started some work of compiling other converts who may only have been sort of partial converts, but were fabulous, fabulous people to read about, really outrageous, and were obviously attracted to the materials of the faith, even if that was as far as they went. So there's degrees of, feelings of observance or belonging. So it was definitely a really exciting time to become a Catholic, especially for artists. And something about the imagination amongst English artists responded to this resurgence of Catholic piety. The other thing about all of these women, they all had quite a big suffering, baby loss, widowhood, mental illness, and both the suffering and their creative capacity seems to have brought them to the faith, and that combination of those three things produced often if they were already established novelists like Kay Smith, after conversion and some kind of loss, suddenly the novels become great. They were always good, but that combination of the faith and the suffering, their creative minds just go, they explode.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of them, like I said, did read Newman, and that was obviously a huge momentum around him, just him giving people that confidence to actually own the faith in public, and not just him, but people around him. But I suppose one of the things he pointed out about the threats of liberalism to religion, arguably artists felt the same threats to art, some anyway. There's an argument to be made, I suppose, that the artist needs truth in order for a drama to emerge. If there isn't good and evil or sin and salvation, well then everything becomes a bit fluid, and there's nothing to latch on to for the imagination and for the artist to put into words or into a dramatic enactment those existential dramas that we all feel experientially that we live through. So I think a lot of artists were part of, like Evelyn Waugh, for instance, he was part of, or went along with the sort of aestheticists that were popular at the time, but beauty as such can only get you so far. It's good and it's important, but ultimately, as we Catholics know, it is connected and has to be connected with truth and goodness, or else it's not really beauty at all. And I think that's what a lot of artists felt that at the time. Yeah.
It came to mind, my field is moral philosophy, and the women, there's a book you might have seen, The Women Are Up to Something, where they talk about the 4 women at St. Somerville College at Oxford. And I'm thinking, for 2 questions. One is that they came sort of after the war, World War II, but they were incredibly impactful in ethical thought. And so I didn't know if one character everybody pretty much knows, Iris Murdoch, is famous for being a novelist and a philosopher. Did any of these women write more philosophical types of books? And is there any connection between the father of 4 daughters, the feminine voice in moral philosophy? And I feel it's not, it's literature, but it's philosophy as well. I didn't know if there was an overlap in some way,
Yeah,
part of a tradition.
That's a really beautiful question, actually. Josephine Ward, so she did write some on marriage and baptism, and that would have been considered moral theology at that time. But she also, philosophy, but she also, in her letters, her husband, who was a philosopher, ran everything by her, it seemed like, and they have many letters back and forth. And her daughter, Maisie Ward, was also a philosopher in her own right. And so,
Sheehan Ward.
they set up Sheehan Ward. And so a lot of the philosophy that you get from these women aren't necessarily going to be in the same treatise type form that you're going to get from the men. But if you really start looking at their notebooks and their notes and their author notes and their letters, you really do get a sense that they're just as philosophically astute as the men of the era.
Well, as an example, The Sovereignty of the Good is one of the great books.
Sure.
But I would say they're using the fictional form precisely to pose, I think these women are using fiction precisely to pose those questions. I think that's one of the things we find so exciting about them. They are very thoughtful theologically, but they're using fiction as the method, which is really, it's much easier for us, well, definitely me, but I think most of us naturally we're made for parable and story and narrative, and philosophical truths arrive more easily through that form than, as you say, the treatise. So I think we can treat them as philosophers even if they didn't publish in nonfiction, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just briefly to add that Carol Hausländer, whom most of you will know, of course, wrote a lot of spiritual writings. That's her background, and that shines through in her novel. And there are, I mean, we have talked about eventually perhaps even including essays in this series here and there, because of course there are people like Alice Meynell, or there was a lot of female intellectual activity going on at a time when we tend to think women had no voice and no role, and that's partly the sort of prejudice that we're trying to highlight as being wrong. Yeah. Well, yeah.
In all your spare time, yeah. Well, let's thank our speakers one last time. Thank you.